We all need to criticize Islam all the time. I don't think I can overestimate and overstate how important it is for you, your family, your friends, your neighbours, your townsfolk, your fellow citizens of your country and your international allies to start, if you haven't already started, and to continue to criticize Islam at every opportunity you can. I'm not talking about the threat of terrorism here. I'm talking about the inexorable and carefully planned overwhelming of European culture and thought by sheer numbers. A totally legal and utterly unstoppable Islamic tsunami that remarkably still is barely recognized by mainstream Western political leaders. This might sound extreme, but I'm going to give you two reasons. Firstly, any individual or organization, political party, doctrine or intellectual movement that specifically and uniquely claims for itself the God-given right not to be criticized in any way whatsoever deserves to be criticized remorselessly in order to teach it that in the free Western world, criticism is not only a normal and healthy aspect of every part of life, but it is an essential aspect of every part of life. It is critical thinking and the ability to indulge oneself in it without fear of prosecution or death that has created the freedoms that you and your families hold dear. And secondly, if you and I do not actively criticize Islam, it is quite likely, at its present rate, to destroy the last semblance of European and then American freedom of speech altogether. Islam in every form, from moderate to extreme, stands for values diametrically opposed to those of secular freedom of thought, speech and action. To put the threat in context, I consider that it's so great that the recent social effects in both loss of life and altered lives of the violent Muslim terrorist actions of 9/11 and 7/7 will appear numerically as insignificant in comparison to the similarly measured impact of Muslim majorities gaining political control in Western countries. And I want to make it clear to you that I'm not advocating any form of unreasonable criticism here. I don't want to encourage aggression or violence or intimidation. I suggest you criticize with intelligence, energy and wit. Be calm, considered, informed. Let gentle but incredibly firm reason dictate the message that you repeat. And why is it so important? Islam is going to take over the Western world, not by violence and force, but by intelligence, by political manipulation, and by sheer weight of numbers. Our political leaders have already been outwitted, are now being outwitted, and probably will continue to be outwitted by the far more driven and focused Muslim strategists. The birth rate of non-Muslim Europeans in the whole of Europe is declining. The birth rate of Muslim Europeans is rocketing. The UK has now legalized bigamy for Muslim men, a thing that remains illegal and heavily punishable by imprisonment for non-Muslim native British citizens. So Muslim men can marry 2, 3 wives, all maintained by the state, and they can then produce literally dozens of children, all legal, all paid for by the state. Add some figures together, and how much do you think this will cost the UK benefit and health systems over, say, the next 20 years? National bankruptcy might not be attractive to you and me, but to Muslims it marks the joyful weakening of an enemy, a non-Muslim infidel state that must be replaced by the one true faith. Now Gordon Brown wants to make it illegal to criticize Islam. And need I say more? Well, okay, let's say a little bit more. Turning to other European countries, the Netherlands is predicted to have a majority Muslim population by 2017. Did you hear that? 2017. Now Brussels City Council has a socialist government. Muslims hold 10 out of the 18 seats. The city of Brussels, the capital city of the EU, has a majority Muslim government now, not in 20 years, now. A recent survey showed 36% of young Muslims in the UK believe that leaving Islam should be punished by death. In France, the police are not allowed into Muslim areas. Not allowed. Cannot go. Are legally not allowed to go into Muslim areas in France. In Denmark, 51% of Muslims think that freedom of speech should be replaced by respect for religious feelings. and it's estimated that the 4 largest cities in Holland will have a Muslim majority within the next decade. Now, journalists, politicians, teachers, writers, artists throughout the whole of Europe are now becoming so scared of threats of violence and death from Islam that they're either having to go around with armed guards, go into hiding, or simply promise that they will not criticize Islam again, and they beg that they and their families are not hurt or killed. Pim Fortuyn, who was a Dutch MP, talked about Islam in Europe back in 2002, and he said, "It is 5 minutes to 12, not only in the Netherlands, but in the whole of Europe." This was, of course, by the way, just before he was brutally murdered for speaking out against halal practices with animals. Don't shelve this one. Don't think that someone else will deal with it. They won't. Read a bit about Churchill and his ignored warnings during the 1930s. And please don't think that your political leaders have learned these lessons and now know best. They didn't then. They don't now. They're concerned about their own safety, the safety of their families. They dare not speak out against Islam. The only way they will dare to do so is if there is such a groundswell from non-Muslim Europeans, like you and me, that they become just one of the many targets for the axe. I'm asking you to stand up along with every other free-minded Western citizen and refuse to accept that our history and traditions, our freedoms and aspirations are to be destroyed by Islam, a political system based on superstition that can never be criticised, ever, by Muslims or non-Muslims. And I know that some of you listening to this are still thinking that I'm being extreme. I mean, unfortunately we don't have a Churchill now, and the only uncensored voices that you're going to hear are those little voices of little people like me. And that's only until mediums like YouTube are finally silenced by our own duly elected political representatives, bowing to the ever-increasing pressure from these highly intelligent Islamic opportunists who will get YouTube banned. They will. And where will you and I then go to express and share our freely held views? Who will listen to our voices then? Believe me, the lights are going out all over Europe. So while we still have this level of freely available freedom of speech, use it, because if you don't, you will lose it. The price of democracy has always been perpetual vigilance, and our politicians have not been vigilant. We haven't been vigilant. It's only in the past 6 months or so that even I have been aware of the problem of Islam in Europe. When did you first start to think about it? And didn't you think that people who were talking to you about it, when you first heard about it, were extreme? So how long do you think it's going to take to start getting receptive listeners who at the moment still feel the same as you and I did 6 months ago? I for one know that even now when I try to talk to friends and family about the threat of Islam, they turn away and think I'm being extreme. They're not to blame. They really cannot believe that something as big and dangerous as this could possibly have been allowed to creep up on their precious countries without their knowing. Neville Chamberlain was warmly received by the British public when he came back from signing the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938. He said, "Peace in our time." On the 30th of September 1938, the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, less than 1 year later. Now, Douglas Murray used this thought test in a 2007 lecture on the Jihad Against the West. He said, if you wanted to make a criticism of something, what could you possibly do that would be smaller than drawing a cartoon? I know this was way back in December 2007, but let me mention what Islam thinks about this. Well, there was a group of Danish school kids that went on a scout trip, and they had their own mini cartoon writing competition. They videoed it with their mobile phones, I think. Footage of it was passed on to one of the Imams in Denmark, who issued a fatwa against these young boys, that they should be put to death. People have been trying to raise enough money to protect them. Now, do you think that drawing a little cartoon of something should carry the death penalty? If this country becomes a Muslim majority country, and on current progress it will, then drawing such trivial cartoons will be punishable by death. If you don't believe me, read the Quran for yourself. Look into how many people have lost their hands and heads, or have been stoned to death in Saudi Arabia within the past 7 days. This isn't something that might happen. It will happen, unless we do something about it.